I hadn't planned on moving into my grandfather's cabin. The decision wasn't born from excitement or some nostalgic dream of the outdoors. It was more like a reluctant necessity. Rent in the city had bled me dry, and when the lawyer's letter arrived with the news of the inheritance, I took it as a sign. A quiet place in the woods, with no neighbors for miles, sounded like the only break I was ever going to get. My grandfather had always called it his hunting retreat, though I'd never once seen him bring home so much as a squirrel. He was a man who kept his habits private, his hobbies stranger still. Now that he was gone, the cabin was mine to figure out. The drive stretched longer than I expected. The roads narrowed until they became little more than cracked ribbons of asphalt swallowed by the forest. At a gas station on the edge of town, the attendant stared at me longer than felt natural. His eyes lingered as if he recognized me, though I had never been there before. When I mentioned I was heading toward the old cabin on Ashwick Ridge, he stopped mid-motion, the pump handle still in his grip. For a second, he looked like he wanted to say something. Instead, he muttered, "You be careful up there," and wouldn't meet my eyes again. I told myself it was small-town weirdness, nothing more. But the forest seemed to grow thicker the closer I got, pressing in against the road, branches clawing the roof of my car like fingers. By the time I reached the cabin's dirt drive, the sun was bleeding out behind the trees, leaving everything wrapped in gray shadow. The cabin stood where memory only half remembered it, 2 stories of dark wood, a porch sagging under the weight of years, and windows that reflected the last light of the day like watchful eyes. I carried my bags inside, the air thick with the smell of dust and pine sap. The interior felt preserved. A rifle still rested above the mantel. A pair of boots stood neatly by the door, as if my grandfather had just stepped outside and never returned. His presence lingered in the strangest details. A rocking chair positioned to face the window, a cup on the counter with a faint brown ring at the bottom, yellowed newspaper clippings pinned to a corkboard by the stairs. One of them, dated decades ago, carried a headline about missing hunters in Ashwick Forest. Someone had circled it in red pen, pressing hard enough to tear the paper. That first night, I told myself I would just unpack, eat, and rest. But sleep didn't come easily. The woods outside never seemed to quiet. Crickets gave way to the low groan of branches, then something heavier sound of movement, too deliberate to be wind. Every so often, I swore I heard crunching in the leaves just beyond the porch, a slow pacing, as though something out there already knew I had arrived. At some point past midnight, I sat up in bed and held my breath. The air inside the cabin felt charged, like the atmosphere before a storm. The creaking of the old house echoed louder than it should have, the shadows pooling thicker in the corners. When I finally dared glance toward the window, I thought I saw a shape tall, unmoving just beyond the glass. By the time I blinked, it was gone. I told myself I was imagining it, just a product of exhaustion and the long drive. Still, I locked the door and drew the curtains tight. My grandfather had always been a cautious man. Maybe that was why he left the cabin to me. Or maybe, as I lay awake listening to something move in the trees, it was because he knew I wouldn't be alone out here. Morning came slow, gray light seeping through the curtains as though even the sun hesitated to touch this place. My body ached with the kind of restless sleep that feels like no sleep at all. I brewed coffee from the old tin my grandfather left behind, its bitter taste grounding me for the day. The unease of the night before clung to me, but daylight softened it, convincing me I'd let nerves twist ordinary sounds into something sinister. Still, the woods outside held a silence I couldn't ignore. Birds sang in fits and starts, but cut off abruptly, as if warned into quiet. The trees swayed with a rhythm I couldn't feel on my own skin. Everything seemed to watch, waiting for me to step wrong. It wasn't long before I noticed the envelope. It lay on the counter, where I hadn't seen it the night before. My name was written in my grandfather's shaky hand, the letters uneven, smudged as though written in a hurry. The seal had already been broken. I hesitated before opening it, half expecting to find nothing, or worse, something I didn't want to read. Inside was a folded sheet of yellowed paper, creased, as if handled many times. Across the top, underlined twice, were the words, "Rules for staying alive in the cabin." I let out a nervous laugh, telling myself it was just his way of being dramatic. But as I read the list, the humor drained from me. The rules: lock every door and window before sundown. Check twice. Do not look outside after midnight, no matter what you hear. If you hear footsteps on the porch, stay silent. Do not respond. Never go into the forest after dark. If you are caught outside, do not run in a straight line. At 3:17 a.m., the house may shake. Do not leave your bed until it stops. If you wake to find the rocking chair moving, close your eyes. Do not open them again until morning. Never acknowledge anyone who calls your name from the tree line, especially if it sounds like me. My first instinct was to set the paper down, laugh again, and move on with my day. But my grandfather had never been a man for jokes. Every word carried the weight of someone who had lived by them. Each rule felt less like superstition and more like instruction, written for survival. I carried the paper to the living room, staring at the rocking chair. It was still, motionless. Dust settled deep into its cracks. I told myself, the old man had probably gone senile in his final years, slipping into paranoia. Maybe he wrote these as a way of coping. Yet, the way the words were etched into the page, bold pressed deep into the paper, felt deliberate, like he wanted to make sure no one ever misunderstood. By noon, I decided to venture into town for supplies. The small general store looked almost too old to still be operating. Its wooden sign cracked and faded. The woman behind the counter eyed me cautiously as I approached. When I told her where I was staying, her hand stilled mid-scan over my items. She asked, in a quiet voice, "Did he leave you the paper?" Her question froze me. I asked what she meant, though I already knew. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she handed me the receipt and said, "Just don't take those rules lightly. People around here know better." On the drive back, the envelope burned a hole in my pocket. The rules weren't some private paranoia. Others knew them too. That made them real in a way I didn't want to accept. Back at the cabin, I walked the perimeter, checking locks, examining the forest's edge. I imagined what it might feel like to hear footsteps approach at night, or worse, to hear my name carried from the trees. A chill crept into me, as though the woods themselves leaned closer when I thought about it. That evening, I followed the first rule. Every door locked, every window latched and checked twice. The act felt ridiculous at first, almost theatrical. But when darkness fell over the forest, it brought with it a pressure that made the locks feel necessary. The stillness outside thickened, broken only by faint rustling in the underbrush. My eyes kept darting to the windows. Searching for movement, I told myself I wouldn't find Dot around midnight. I fought the urge to peek outside. The rules burned in my mind. Do not look outside after midnight, no matter what you hear. I tried to distract myself with the creak of the cabin settling, the hum of the old refrigerator. But then, faintly, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of leaves crunching just beyond the porch. Slow, deliberate steps, circling. I froze, the blood in my veins heavy as stone. Whoever, or whatever, was out there moved with patience, not curiosity. The steps stopped directly in front of the door. A shadow crossed the thin slit beneath it, blotting out the faint light of the moon. And then came the sound I had been warned of, a single knock. Not loud, not frantic, just enough to say, "I know you're in there." My pulse thundered in my ears, but I forced myself to stay still, silent, remembering the third rule. The knock came again, followed by a voice. My name, whispered low, as though someone stood inches from the wood. The voice was wrong. It carried the right shape of my name, but not the right sound. like someone who had only recently learned how to form the letters. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I just sat there in the dark, staring at the folded paper on the table, and realized with growing dread that the rules weren't a suggestion. They were a warning. The knock never came again that night, but the voice lingered in my ears long after the footsteps faded into the forest. By morning, the fear felt almost foolish. Sunlight poured through the windows, warm and ordinary, like the night had been a dream I'd let get too deep into my head. I told myself I wasn't going to let paranoia control me. That's how people lose themselves living, by a set of rules they don't understand. So I decided to test one, not intentionally, not at first. It started with curiosity. Rule 2. Do not look outside after midnight, no matter what you hear. Easy enough to follow, unless you're lying awake at 12:30. Every nerve screaming at the sound of something dragging through the leaves. It was subtle at first, a faint scraping, like cloth catching against bark. But then it circled the cabin, pausing every so often, as though waiting for me to react. I stared at the clock on the nightstand. 12:41. My chest tightened. I thought of my grandfather's shaky handwriting, of the way he underlined every rule like it was carved in stone. But another part of me, the rational, stubborn part, rebelled. What could possibly be so dangerous about looking outside? At worst, I'd see a raccoon or a deer nosing around the porch. At best, I'd prove to myself that these rules were nothing more than an old man's dementia. The scraping stopped. Silence pressed against the walls of the cabin. My hand moved before I'd fully made the decision. I slipped out of bed, crossed the creaking floor, and drew back the curtain just an inch. What I saw didn't make sense. At first I thought it was a man, tall, thin, standing just beyond the porch rail, but the longer I looked, the more wrong the shape became. Its arms hung too long, reaching past its knees, its head tilted in a way that bent the neck too sharply, and the face, if it had one, was a blur, as though the night itself smeared its features away. It stood perfectly still, except for its mouth. That moved slowly, like it was repeating something. I pressed my ear to the glass, straining to hear, and caught it. My name, over and over, mouthed but not voiced, lips stretching too far with each syllable. The curtain slipped from my hand. I stumbled back, heart hammering, realizing what I had done. I had broken the rule, and the thing knew it. The air inside the cabin thickened, heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. The silence was no longer silence but expectation, the pause before something decides to act. My instincts screamed at me to run, to bolt every door again, but my body locked up. I stood frozen until, at last, the scraping started again, this time from the porch itself. It moved to the door, a soft press against the wood, as though testing the barrier between us. The handle rattled once, twice, then stilled. My grandfather's lock held. That was the only thing between me and it. Minutes crawled into hours. I sat on the floor with my back to the wall, clutching the folded paper of rules in my fist like a holy relic. Every time I thought it was gone, the porch groaned under its weight again. It didn't leave until the first gray streaks of dawn filtered into the cabin. When I finally dared open the door that morning, the porch boards bore new marks. Long scratches, deep into the wood, as though carved by something with nails too sharp to be human. I understood then why the rules existed. I had only bent one, and already it had tried to get in. I didn't sleep the next night. Not really. Every time my eyes closed, I saw that shape again, tall, blurred, lips moving soundlessly in the dark. Every sound outside the cabin twisted into its footsteps. Every groan of the wood became its weight, shifting closer. I told myself I'd follow the rules now, all of them. No more testing, no more second guessing. But fear does strange things to resolve. It started on the third night. A storm rolled in, thunder rumbling across the ridge, the trees bowing and twisting in the wind. The power flickered, then died completely, plunging the cabin into a suffocating dark. I lit an oil lantern I'd found in the cupboard, its small flame doing little to chase back the shadows. The rules seemed to pulse in my mind like a heartbeat, especially one I hadn't thought much about before. If you hear footsteps on the porch, stay silent. Do not respond. The storm should have drowned out everything, but just past midnight, I heard them footsteps, slow and heavy, climbing the porch steps. The boards groaned under each one, deliberate and steady. I froze, the lantern's flame trembling in the draft. My breath came shallow, each inhale loud enough to betray me. The steps stopped just outside the door. Then, like before, there was a knock, softer this time, patient. And then came the voice. "Open up, please. I need help." It wasn't my name this time. It was a stranger's plea, shaky and human, a woman's voice, muffled by the storm. For a moment, my heart lurched. What if someone was really out there, lost in the storm, desperate for shelter? Could I really just ignore them? But the rules, they echoed in my head, louder than the thunder. Do not respond. The voice came again, closer now, pressed against the door. "I know you're in there. Please, just open the door." I'm freezing. Something about the cadence was off. Too measured, too even, like words spoken without breath. I clutched the rule sheet tighter, forcing myself to stay still, to say nothing. The handle rattled once, twice, then stopped. The silence stretched until I thought it was over. But then, softly, the voice said something that turned my stomach cold. It said my grandfather's name. I nearly dropped the lantern. My grandfather had been dead for weeks. The voice outside spoke his name with perfect clarity, as though it knew him, as though it had been waiting. I stumbled back from the door, pressing myself into the corner of the room, fighting the urge to scream. The handle rattled one last time, violently, and then the footsteps retreated, slowly at first, then vanishing into the howl of the storm. I didn't move until morning, when I finally dared to open the door. The porch was soaked from the rain, but the steps weren't right. They didn't belong to boots or bare feet. They were too long, too narrow, pressed deep into the wood, as if claws had carried the weight. That was the night I stopped doubting. The rules weren't just warnings, they were the only thing keeping me alive. Still, I couldn't stop wondering. Why those specific instructions? Why 3:17 a.m.? Why the rocking chair? Each unanswered question felt like a thread pulling me deeper into something my grandfather had never explained. And then came the next night, when I would learn exactly why the rules were written the way they were. The storm left the forest drenched and heavy. 4 hours, water dripped from the trees in steady rhythms, like 100 clocks ticking out of sync. I spent the morning pacing the cabin, clutching the rule sheet like scripture. Sleep deprivation gnawed at me, and fear was burrowing into my thoughts like rot. I needed answers. I started by searching the cabin more carefully. My grandfather was a secretive man, and if he had lived by these rules for so long, there had to be something here. Evidence, notes, explanations. I pulled open drawers, rifled through boxes in the pantry, lifted floorboards where they creaked hollow. At first, I found nothing more than old receipts, hunting magazines, boxes of rifle rounds. But then, in the back of a wardrobe upstairs, I discovered a metal tin. Rust clung to the edges, and the lock had long since broken. Inside were folded papers, photographs, and what looked like journal pages torn from a leather-bound book. The first page I unfolded was brittle, written in my grandfather's sharp, deliberate script. It wasn't a diary entry, it was more like a report. October 14th, 1982, another one gone last night. Heard the screams from the tree line around 2 a.m. by morning. No trace. Same patterns as before. Always the same. The rules still hold, but the price for breaking them is paid quick. I warned them. Nobody listens until it's too late. The next pages were worse. Sketches of tall, crooked figures, their arms dragging toward the ground, their faces smudged into nothing. Notes scribbled in the margins. They mimic, they call, they wait. I sifted through photographs, grainy, washed out. Some showed hunters posing with deer, but others were taken at night. Blurred shapes standing in the woods, their outlines just barely visible in the flashlight beam. In one, the figure stood on the cabin porch itself, towering, its face washed away by motion blur. I dropped the photo, bile rising in my throat. My grandfather hadn't imagined any of this. He had documented it. Buried under the pile was another folded sheet, different from the rest. It was a letter, never sent. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. Don't think of the cabin as a home. Think of it as a trap with thin walls. The rules aren't superstition, they're barriers. They keep the things out, mostly, but only if you follow them. I've done my part. Now it's yours. The words shook in my hands. I thought of the voice outside the door, the shape at the window, the scratches on the porch. None of it had been my imagination. By afternoon, I needed air. I stepped out onto the porch, the forest steaming under the weak sunlight. Despite everything, curiosity pulled me toward the tree line. Just a few steps, I told myself. Just enough to see. The ground was soft, and sure enough, the prints remained long, narrow impressions, too deep for a person, too stretched for an animal. They trailed off into the woods. I stopped at the edge of the trees. My grandfather's fourth rule repeated in my head. Never go into the forest after dark. If you are caught outside, do not run in a straight line. The wording nagged at me. If you are caught outside. He had known there were times you couldn't avoid it. Times the rules weren't enough. I retreated quickly, locking the door behind me, heart pounding. That evening, I returned to the tin, combing through every scrap. One brittle page described a night in 1979 when my grandfather and another hunter, a man named Marcus, stayed at the cabin. Marcus had broken a rule. He looked out the window after midnight. The entry ended abruptly. Marcus screamed once. By the time I opened the door at dawn, there was nothing left of him but drag marks in the mud. I wanted to believe my grandfather had been exaggerating, but the photographs told a different story. In one, taken the morning after, the porch boards bore scratches identical to the ones I'd found days ago. It wasn't just my grandfather either. Deeper in the pile, I found a weathered newspaper clipping. Local man found dead near Ashwick Ridge. Body mutilated, cause unknown. The article was dated 1965. Another clipping from 1957 mentioned, disappearances plague hunters near Ridge. My grandfather hadn't invented the rules, he'd inherited them. Just like I had by nightfall, I sat in the living room. The pages scattered around me. The rules weren't just instructions. They were survival passed down across decades. Each generation learning the hard way. And then, at 3:17 a.m., I learned why one of them was so specific. It started with a low vibration, subtle at first, like a truck passing on a distant road. But it grew, rattling the window panes, shaking dust from the rafters. The rocking chair began to move, creaking forward and back, in rhythm with the tremor. My heart slammed against my ribs as I clutched the sheets of paper. Rule 5. At 3:17 a.m., the house may shake. Do not leave your bed until it stops. I wanted to run, to flee out the door into the night, but the warnings anchored me. I forced myself to stay in bed, covers pulled over my head like a child. The shaking grew violent. Objects slid from shelves. A picture frame cracked against the floor. And beneath the thunder of the tremors, I heard something else. A low moan, rising from beneath the cabin, as if the earth itself was groaning in pain. Then, footsteps. Not outside. Inside. Heavy, dragging, moving across the floorboards downstairs. The rules hadn't warned me about that. I bit my fist to keep from screaming as the footsteps moved through the kitchen, into the hall, stopping at the bottom of the stairs, slowly. The shaking subsided. The chair stilled. The footsteps faded, retreating the way they had come. Silence returned, oppressive and absolute. When I finally dared to rise, the cabin looked like nothing had happened. No footprints, no broken wood, nothing, except the chariot was turned now, angled toward the staircase, as if it had been waiting for me to come down. That was the moment I realized something terrible. The rules weren't complete. They told me how to survive most nights, but not all of them. My grandfather had left something out, something he either couldn't face or didn't want me to know. And if the rules were already failing me, then I had no idea how long I could last. The next day bled into night before I even realized it. I was unraveling. The rules had kept me alive so far, but I knew now they weren't enough. There were gaps, things my grandfather had never written down. Maybe he thought the list was long enough. Maybe he thought whoever came after him wouldn't be stubborn or stupid enough to stay. By dusk, the forest felt different. The silence wasn't patient anymore. It was charged, restless, like the woods themselves were anticipating something. I locked every window and door twice, then checked again. I dragged furniture against the entryway, more for my own sanity than for security. When the last light slipped away, the cabin seemed to exhale. Darkness pooled around it, thick and complete. The air felt colder than the night before, as though something had drawn heat out of the walls. I sat in the living room with the lantern burning low, listening. It didn't take long. The first sound came from the tree-lined branches, snapping under weight too heavy for deer. Then silence. Then again, closer. A rhythm emerged. Not random, not wandering, hunting. I backed toward the stairs, lantern in hand, every muscle tight with dread. The cabin creaked under its own age, but beneath that, I heard the porch groan. One step, then another, then a third, until the boards whined under something tall and deliberate. The knock came, sharp and sudden. The whole door shuddered in its frame. My breath caught. Rule 3 screamed in my memory. If you hear footsteps on the porch, stay silent. Do not respond. I obeyed. My throat ached with the effort of swallowing the urge to cry out. The knocking stopped. Silence stretched, and then the voice came. Not the woman from the storm. Not my name, whispered through glass. This time, it was my grandfather's voice. Clear, firm, the exact tone he used when I was a child, and he wanted me to listen. Open the door. It's me. You're safe now. The words stabbed through me. I knew he was dead. I had buried him. But hearing his voice like that, so precise, so confident, almost broke me. My hand twitched toward the latch before I snatched it back. The rules. They weren't guidelines, they were lifelines. The voice tried again, louder this time. You're making a mistake. Let me in. When I didn't respond, the handle turned, slowly at first, then violently, rattling in its socket until the whole door shook. The furniture I'd shoved against it scraped across the floor. Dust rained from the ceiling. I stumbled backward, lantern shaking in my grip. The door bowed inward under pressure, wood groaning as if it would splinter. I thought it would break through then and there, but just as suddenly, it stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. I could hear only my own breathing, shallow and ragged. And then a window shattered upstairs. I spun, light spilling wildly across the walls. Glass rained down from the second floor, a cold gust sweeping into the cabin. For a heartbeat, I thought it was just the storm's leftover winds. But then came the sound. Heavy, deliberate, dragging footsteps on the floor above me. My chest locked tight. It was inside. I killed the lantern instantly, plunging the cabin into suffocating dark. The footsteps grew louder, pacing slowly back and forth across the upstairs hallway. Each step creaked, the old wood, pausing between movements like it was listening for me. I crouched in the corner, heart pounding so hard I was sure it would hear me. The rule sheet burned in my pocket, useless now. None of them covered this. The footsteps moved toward the stairs. One groan of the wood, then another, then another. I pressed my back flat against the wall, willing myself invisible as the air thickened. Damp with the smell of soil and rot, it reached the bottom step. My teeth clenched as the lantern's faint residual heat cooled in my hand. In the dark, I couldn't see it, but I felt it. The weight of its presence filled the room like smoke. And then, the voice. Not my grandfather's this time. My own. "Why are you hiding?" The words came from the darkness, low and warped, but undeniably mine. Hearing it nearly broke me. I bit down hard on my fist to stop the scream that clawed its way up my throat. The footsteps circled the room slowly, pausing every few seconds as if to savor my fear. Something brushed the table, knocking a glass to the floor. The crash echoed like a gunshot. I flinched, and the sound stopped. I knew then that it was listening for mistakes, testing me. Minutes stretched into eternities as it prowled, never speaking again, just dragging those heavy feet across the floor. Finally, as the first gray light of dawn seeped into the cracks of the curtains, it retreated. The steps receded toward the shattered window. The silence returned. When I finally lit the lantern again, the room looked untouched, save for the broken glass. But the scratches knew, jagged gouges lined the wood near the door. Fresh, deep, proof that it had tried to get in. I realized something terrible as I cleaned the glass from the floor. The rules worked when you followed them, yes. But the longer I stayed, the bolder it became. It didn't just want me to break a rule. It wanted me worn down, tired, desperate, until I made the mistake willingly, and that meant sooner or later. No matter how careful I was, it would find a way. I couldn't stay locked in ignorance. Every night brought the same torment, and the rules, though they worked, felt incomplete. My grandfather had lived here for decades. He must have known more than he ever wrote down. And if he hadn't, then maybe someone else in town did. So the next morning, I drove back into the small town. The storekeeper, the same woman who'd asked about the paper before, stiffened when she saw me. Her eyes darted to the scratches on my arms, the restless look in my face. "You're still there," she said flatly, almost accusing. "You knew," I whispered. "You all knew. About the rules. About what happens up there." She sighed and looked toward the back of the store, as if to make sure we were alone. "Your grandfather told us to leave you be. Said you had to figure it out yourself. Said it was the only way." Her words hit harder than I expected. My grandfather hadn't just left me the cabin. He had left me a test. A burden. "Why me?" I asked, her lips pressed tight. "Because it doesn't let go of families. Once it has a name, it keeps it. Your grandfather survived because he learned the rules. He thought maybe you could too." The weight of betrayal settled in my stomach. My grandfather hadn't been protecting me with his list. He'd been preparing me to inherit his curse. I pressed her for more, desperate for anything beyond the same cryptic warnings. At first, she shook her head, but when I refused to leave, she finally muttered, "It's older than this town, older than these woods. It mimics, it hunts. The rules are bargains, it can't cross them if you hold to them. But bargains change." That was all she'd give me. When I asked what she meant, she turned away and refused to speak again. I drove back, shaken, but with new clarity. My grandfather hadn't been my savior. He had been my warden, passing the sentence down to me because he couldn't carry it anymore. That night, as I prepared the cabin, I noticed something I hadn't before. On the back of the rule sheet, faint pencil lines sketched across the paper. At first, I thought it was just stray marks, but when I held the lantern close, words emerged, half-raced, written so lightly they almost disappeared into the yellowed page. "The rules only work if you're the one it wants." My blood turned cold. My grandfather hadn't left me the cabin as an inheritance. He had left me as bait. Every moment replayed in my mind, the locked doors, the voices, the rules that seemed tailored to my survival. He hadn't just wanted me to live. He had wanted the thing outside to focus on me, not him, not anyone else. The rules weren't defenses. They were chains. Chains that kept the creature's attention bound to a single name. I nearly tore the paper in half with my grip. My grandfather had doomed me the moment he left me this place. That night, as if to confirm the truth, the knocking returned. 3 sharp raps at the door, and then his voice again. Not distorted this time. Not wrong. Perfect. My grandfather's voice, exactly as I remembered it. "Let me in. You're safe now. We can share the burden." My chest hollowed with rage and grief. He wasn't just gone. He had become part of the trap. Whether it was his voice stolen, or something worse, I didn't know. But it spoke the truth I had been too afraid to face. I wasn't meant to escape. I was meant to endure, to carry the rules, until I either died, or passed them on to someone else. I didn't light the lantern that night. I sat in darkness, clutching the rule sheet. The half-erased words still burned into my mind. The rules only work if you're the one it wants. I understood now. My grandfather hadn't survived all those years because he was careful. He survived because the creature's attention was locked on him. And when he died, it shifted to me. The cabin wasn't protection. It was a lure. A cage meant to hold me in place while the thing outside circled endlessly. So what was left for me? Keep following the rules, dragging out the nights, until exhaustion drove me to slip up, or run, break the chain, and see what happened when I left the forest behind. The decision clawed at me. I couldn't keep living like this, not with the mimic voices and the footsteps that grew bolder every night. The cabin walls had become my coffin, waiting for the lid to close. That night, I tested the locks again, but this time I left the lantern burning bright. I wanted to see. I wanted to know what hunted me, even if it meant breaking every line of ink my grandfather left behind. Midnight came. The first knock rattled the door. Then the voice followed mine again, mocking. "Why are you hiding? You know it doesn't matter." I stood in the living room, fists clenched, staring at the door. The voice shifted this time. My grandfather again. Then the woman from the storm. Then my mother. Voices I couldn't possibly know, layered one over another until they blurred into a chorus of pleading and fury. My chest ached with the weight of it, but I didn't answer. Not yet. At 3:17 a.m., the tremor started. The cabin shook harder than before, dust raining from the rafters. The rocking chairs skidding across the floor as if shoved by unseen hands. The rules screamed in my head, telling me to stay in bed. But I was done being a prisoner. I grabbed the lantern, yanked the door open, and stepped onto the porch. The forest was alive with sound, branches snapping, whispers threading through the trees, voices calling my name from every direction. The prints in the mud were fresh, impossibly long strides that circled the cabin like a predator pacing its cage. The air stank of rot, thick and wet, coating my tongue, and then I saw it. Not blurred through glass this time, not half hidden in shadow. It stood at the tree line, tall and impossible, its body stretched thin, its face an ever-shifting smear of features. Eyes formed and vanished, mouths opened and closed. It wore voices like masks, one after another, each one more familiar than the last. For the first time, I didn't run. I stepped forward. It moved too slow, deliberate, crossing the distance with a patience that chilled me more than speed ever could. The rules warned against running in a straight line if caught outside, but I wasn't running. Not yet. When it reached the edge of the clearing, I saw its hands. Long, clawed fingers, nails black with soil, dragging through the grass. And when it opened its mouth, it spoke in my voice again. Trade places. I understood then. The rules weren't just instructions, they were contracts. I could keep living if I stayed, if I kept its attention. But escape. That meant passing it on. Someone else would have to take my place, just like I had taken my grandfather's. My hands trembled as I lifted the lantern. Its flames sputtered in the wind, casting the creature's face into endless, twisting shapes. I thought of the storekeeper's warning. I thought of the erased line on the paper, and I thought of the choice I had left: either endure or damn someone else. My throat burned with the decision. In the end, I didn't snuff the flame. I hurled the lantern into the porch, fire catching on the dry wood. The cabin hissed to life, flames licking up the walls, smoke curling into the night. The thing recoiled at first, its body bending backward unnaturally, but then it leaned forward again, unshaken, patient. The fire wouldn't kill it, but it would kill the cage. I stumbled back into the clearing as the cabin burned behind me. The rules were ash now. The contract was broken, and as the flames roared higher, the creature tilted its head, watching me, not chasing, not striking, just watching. Because now, without the rules, I didn't know whether it was bound to me, or free to follow wherever I went. I walked until dawn. The forest stretched endlessly around me, every path twisting back on itself, every tree identical to the last. When the first light bled through the branches, I finally collapsed near the dirt road that wound back toward town. My lungs burned, my clothes stank of smoke, and behind my ribs, a single truth beat steady: wasn't free. At the edge of the road, I looked back. The ridge was still there, black smoke curling where the cabin had been, but I saw no shape in the trees, no shadow breaking the morning haze. For the first time, I thought maybe I'd won. I reached town by mid-afternoon, staggering into the same store I'd visited before. The bell chimed overhead, and the storekeeper's face drained of color when she saw me. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "The cabin's gone," I rasped. "Burned to the ground. The rules, they don't matter anymore." Her eyes widened, not with relief, but with horror. She shook her head slowly. "You don't understand. It doesn't need the cabin. That was just where it kept you. If you broke the rules, then it's already decided. It's not bound anymore. It can follow." I felt the floor tilt beneath me. Follow where? She didn't answer. She only stepped back, as if distance from me meant safety. That night, I rented a small room above the bar in town. I told myself I'd leave in the morning, drive far, far away, start over somewhere it couldn't reach. But as I lay in the thin bed, staring at the ceiling, the knock came. 3 sharp raps. Not on the door this time. On the window. I froze, heart hammering. The rules were gone. I had no instructions to cling to anymore. Just silence and dread, slowly, against every instinct screaming inside me. I turned my head. The curtains swayed with the breeze, and behind the glass, a face leaned close. Not blurred, not shifting. My face, smiling. It mouthed something I couldn't hear, fogging the glass with every syllable. Then it raised a hand long, clawed fingers tapping once, twice, 3 times. I shut my eyes, praying it would vanish. But the sound followed me into the dark, tapping steady as a heartbeat. I thought burning the cabin ended it, but now I know better. The rules weren't there to keep it out. They were there to keep it contained, and I set it free.